I am Dr. Saqib Mansoor, and this is my channel, Learning Anatomy. So, this is the second of the series of the lectures on the thalamus. And the first was an introduction on thalamus, and this is the nuclei of the thalamus. So, we discussed that there are three parts of the thalamus. And the first one is the anterior part. Anterior part of the thalamus contains the anterior thalamic nuclei. This is the anterior part of the thalamus, and here are lying the anterior thalamic nuclei. They receive the mammillothalamic tract from the mammillary nuclei. These anterior thalamic nuclei also receive reciprocal connections with the cingulate gyrus and hypothalamus. And the function of the anterior thalamic nucleus is closely associated with that of the limbic system and is concerned with emotional tone and the mechanisms of recent memory, right? Emotional tone and recent memory. These are the anterior nuclei of the thalamus. So after the anterior part, the second part is the medial part. The subdivisions are done in the previous lectures, how they are divided. The medial part of the thalamus contains a large dorsomedial nucleus. Here you could see, yes, this is the dorsomedial nucleus. It's a large one, right? So, and several smaller nuclei. The dorsomedial nucleus has two-way connections with the whole prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. It also has similar connections with the hypothalamic nuclei. It is interconnected with all other groups of thalamic nuclei. So you see, this is a dorsomedial nucleus, very large. Here it runs like this. So as I told you, its description. The medial part of the thalamus is responsible for the integration of a large variety of sensory information, including somatic, visceral, and olfactory information, and the relation of this information to one's emotional feelings and subjective states. Here we go to the next lateral part. These nuclei are subdivided into a dorsal tier and a ventral tier. So the lateral part is divided into the third part, lateral part is subdivided into a dorsal tier of the nuclei and a ventral tier of the nuclei. So first we will discuss the dorsal tier of the nuclei. Of course, so you see these are the lateral dorsal nucleus, lateral posterior nucleus, and the pulvinar, right? So these are the three nuclei of the lateral part with the dorsal tier. These have interconnections with other thalamic nuclei and with parietal lobe, occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and cingulate gyrus. Then is the ventral tier of the nuclei. It has a lot of the number of the nuclei. So these are the following nuclei are arranged in a craniocaudal sequence. Ventral tier of the nuclei of the thalamus made up of the following nuclei in a craniocaudal sequence. Number one, ventral anterior nucleus. Well, here you could see this is the ventral anterior nucleus, right? This is the ventral anterior nucleus, right? And it is connected to the reticular formation, corpus striatum, substantia nigra, and premotor cortex, and also to various other thalamic nuclei. As this nucleus lies on the passage between corpus striatum and motor areas of the frontal cortex, it influences activities of the motor cortex. You see, the ventral anterior nucleus influences activities of motor cortex. Then number two, it's a ventral lateral nucleus. Here, this is the labeling. And here you could see this is the ventral lateral nucleus. For number one was the ventral anterior, and this is the ventral lateral nucleus. Its description is it has similar connections as of a ventral anterior nucleus, but beside that, it has a major input from a cerebellum and a minor input from a red nucleus. Main projections of this nucleus pass to the motor and premotor regions of the cerebral cortex. So it also influences the motor activity, right? This was the description of this nucleus, the ventral and lateral nucleus. So the number 3 is this ventral posterior nucleus with the two subdivisions, ventral posterior nucleus, and it has two subdivisions, ventral posteromedial and ventral posterolateral. Here you could see these two subdivisions. This is the ventral posterolateral nucleus, and this is the ventral posteromedial nucleus. So this is the two subdivisions of the ventral posterior nucleus. Again, you could see this is the ventral posterolateral one, and this is the ventral posteromedial nucleus, right? So first of all, the ventral posteromedial nucleus, this one, this is the lateral and this is the medial. So ventral posteromedial nucleus receives the ascending trigeminal and the gustatory pathways, whereas ventral posterolateral, this one, it receives ascending sensory tracts, medial and spinal lemnisci. Thalamocortical projections from these nuclei pass through posterior limb of the internal capsule and corona radiata to the primary somatic sensory areas of cerebral cortex in post-central gyrus. These are the areas 3, 1, and 2. So the other nuclei of the thalamus, these include intralaminar nuclei, the reticular nucleus, the midline nuclei, and the lateral and medial geniculate bodies. Intralaminar nuclei, these are the, this is the internal medullary lamina. Here you see this is the stem, and here it splits to make a Y shape, told in my previous lecture. So internal medullary lamina and the nuclei, you see this lying here, are the intralaminar nuclei, tiny collections of nerve cells lying within the internal medullary lamina. So they receive afferent fibers from reticular formation and also fibers from spinothalamic and trigeminothalamic tracts. And they send efferent fibers to other thalamic nuclei, which in turn project to the cerebral cortex, and fibers to the corpus striatum. Right, so connections will be discussed in my next lecture, these nuclei and their connections with the separate pictures and the images. Influences level of the alertness and consciousness in an individual, right? Yes, this reticular formation is involved, so the level of alertness and consciousness is monitored. Then are the midline nuclei, right? You could see this. These are the midline nuclei, made up of groups of the nerve cells lying near to third ventricle and in interthalamic connection. Of course, this is interthalamic connection or interthalamic adhesion told in my previous lecture. It connects the two sides of the lamina, the right thalamus with the left thalamus, and here lying the midline nuclei. Receive afferent fibers from the reticular formation. This is the various nuclei of the thalamus. This is an enlarged picture, right? You could see this various. I've already told you many of those. And then is the reticular nucleus. Reticular. Here is lying that this is the reticular nucleus, a slim layer of the nerve cells that is sandwiched between external medullary lamina and posterior limb of the internal capsule. Afferent fibers converge on the reticular nucleus from cerebral cortex and reticular formation. This is the reticular nucleus. Again, you see, output is mainly to the other thalamic nuclei, and via this nucleus, the cerebral cortex regulates the thalamic activity. You could see this is the reticular nucleus, right? So metathalamus, this is a term, metathalamus. So this include these two nuclei, the medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body, metathalamus. So first we study the medial geniculate body. You could see this located the medial geniculate body lying over here. This is the pulvinar, and this is the medial geniculate body, and this is the lateral geniculate body. As these are so important, these two geniculate bodies. So here I enlarge the picture, right? You could see this is the pulvinar of the thalamus, and this is a medial geniculate body, and this is the lateral geniculate body. So medial geniculate body forms part of auditory pathway. So the medial geniculate body is concerned with hearing. You could remember a tape and M for music, right? So music is for, of course, hearing, auditory system. So the medial geniculate body is responsible for auditory pathways. It's a swelling on posterior surface of the thalamus below the pulvinar. Here you could see, here it is, right? Afferent fibers to the medial geniculate body constitute inferior brachium and come from inferior colliculus. I will show you a picture of this. You can find it on my lecture on midbrain. Inferior colliculus receives termination of fibers of the lateral lemniscus, right? Medial geniculate body collects auditory information from both ears, but predominantly from opposite ear. Efferent fibers leave medial geniculate body to comprise auditory radiation that pass to auditory cortex of superior temporal gyrus. Here you could see, this is the whole description. Here you could see, this is the, spiral ganglion of, cochlea. This is the cochlear nerve, and here it is going to the cochlear nuclei. This is anterior, and this is the, posterior cochlear nucleus. And then the pathway goes to this trapezoid body, posterior nucleus, and the superior olivary nucleus. And from here, it reaches the lateral, forms a lateral lemniscus, and fibers going to the medial geniculate body. This is the tracing of the, auditory system, auditory pathway. And here you could see, this is the acoustic radiation or the auditory radiation going to the of the internal capsule, acoustic radiation of the internal capsule. And here it is reaching the auditory cortex of superior temporal gyrus, right? This is a very brief description of the auditory pathway, which in detail I will discuss later. So let's talk about the lateral geniculate body. Similarly, this L for light, L tip is that, L for light. So visual pathway, it forms part of the visual pathway, lateral geniculate body. Here you could see, this is the lateral geniculate body. It's a swelling on under surface of the pulvinar of the thalamus. These are the nuclei of the thalamus. I told you this is pulvinar, and on its under surface you could find this lateral geniculate body, right? And it is made up of 6 layers of nerve cells. Very important, 6 layers of nerve cells. And here all but a few fibers of optic tract terminate. The fibers which do not reach here pass to the pretectal nucleus. The fibers are axons of ganglion cells, layers of retina, and reach here from nasal half of the contralateral eye and temporal half of the ipsilateral eye, in the form of fibers crossing midline in the optic chiasma. I'll show you the picture again, this time again. Thus, each one of the lateral geniculate body receives visual information from opposite field of vision. How it happens, I tell you, just to wait a bit, right? This is the lateral geniculate body. Efferent fibers leave lateral geniculate body to constitute visual radiation that passes to visual cortex of occipital lobe. Here you could go. Yes, this is the, optic nerve. Here it forms optic chiasma. Here is the optic tract, and the fibers reach the lateral geniculate body. And from here, this is from the optic radiation, and it reaches this visual cortex with the present in the occipital lobe. Right? So this is the thing. Efferent fibers leave the lateral geniculate body to constitute visual radiation that passes to visual cortex of occipital lobe. This is the description. I will, of course, discuss this visual pathway in separate in quite detail. So in the last slides, as you could see, this is a comparison of the median and lateral geniculate bodies. This is the medial geniculate body. Number one is the shape. This is oval shaped collection of the gray matter on the undersurface of the pulvinar. And this lateral geniculate body, which is the bean shaped collection of gray matter on the undersurface of the pulvinar. And in the medial geniculate body, hilum is absent. And here in the lateral one, the hilum is present. Number three, no lamination there. And in the lateral geniculate body, it is made up of laminae, six laminae, numbered 1 to 6 from ventral to dorsal surface. And medial geniculate body's destruction on one side has little or no effect on hearing. And its destruction, the lateral geniculate body's destruction on one side produces blindness in the opposite half of the field of vision. I told you the reason already. And number 5, last relay station of the auditory pathway, this medial one. And this is 5 is the last relay station on the visual pathway, right? So number 6, it sends auditory impulse through auditory radiation to the auditory area of the temporal lobe, right? And this sends visual impulses through optic radiation to the visual radiation to the cortex of occipital lobe, right? This destination is the temporal lobe, superior temporal gyrus. This is the occipital lobe, right? And these are the Brodmann areas should be discussed in the cerebrum, just coming very soon on my channel Learning Anatomy. I thank you very much for being here and listening to my lecture. Thank you very much. I'll very soon upload a new lecture on the thalamus, which would be its connections. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Take good care. Stay safe.